Now, this is from Liberty and Tyranny. The modern liberal believes in the supremacy of the state, thereby rejecting the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the order of the civil society. For the modern liberal, the individual's imperfection and personal pursuits impede the objective of a utopian state. Oh, yes, folks, you hear lots of people talk about this now. This came out 16 months ago. Now, in this, modern liberalism promotes what French historian Alexis de Tocqueville described as a soft tyranny, which becomes increasingly more oppressive, potentially leading to a hard tyranny, that is, some form of totalitarianism. So as the word liberal is in its classical meaning the opposite of authoritarian, it is more accurate, therefore, to characterize the modern liberal as a statist. Now, incidentally, I did not invent that word. It goes back as far as Aristotle, but I decided to reintroduce it in modern political parlance because it had been lost. Now, what is the legacy of the statist? Well, he's turned the federal government into the nation's largest creditor, debtor, lender, employer, consumer, contractor, grantor, property owner, tenant, insurer, healthcare provider, and pension guarantor. And yet the statist has an insatiable appetite for control. His sights are set on his next meal even before he has fully digested his last. Now, folks, as I go through this, think about what's going on today. It's not that I'm prescient. It's that this is tyranny, and this is how it works. The statist is constantly agitating for government action. And in furtherance of that purpose, the statist speaks in the tongue of the demagogue, concocting one pretext and grievance after another to manipulate public perceptions and build popular momentum for the divestiture of liberty and property from its rightful possessors. That would be you. The industrious, earnest, and successful are demonized as perpetrators of various offenses against the public good, which, of course, justifies governmental intervention on behalf of an endless parade of victims. In this way, the perpetrator and the victim are subordinated to the government's authority. The perpetrator by outright theft, and the so-called victim by a dependent existence. In truth, both are made victims by the real perpetrator, the statist. The statist veils his pursuits in moral indignation. I'm going to kick his ass, intoning in high dudgeon the injustices and inequities of liberty and life itself, for which only he can provide justice and bring a righteous resolution. And when the resolution proves elusive, as it undoubtedly does, whether the Marxist promise of the workers' paradise or the Great Society's war on poverty, the statist demands ever more authority to wring out the imperfections of mankind's existence. And unconstrained by constitutional prohibitions, what is left to limit the statist's ambitions but his own moral compass, which has already led him astray? He's never circumspect about his own shortcomings. Failure is not the product of his beliefs, but merely want of power and resources. Thus are born endless rationalizations for seizing ever more governmental authority. The statist also knows that despite his successful usurpations, enough citizens are still skeptical and even distrustful of politicians and government that he cannot force his will all at once. Thus he marches in incremental steps, adjusting his pace as circumstances dictate. Today his pace is more rapid, for resistance has slowed. And in no time does the statist do an about-face. But we must ask ourselves, when faced with the statist and his agenda, how many enterprises and jobs might have been created? How many people might have been saved from illness and disease? How many more poor children might have been fed but for the additional costs, market dislocations, and management inefficiencies that distort supply and demand or discourage research and development as a result of the federal government's role? Liberty's permeance in American society often makes its manifestations elusive or invisible to those born into it. Even if liberty is acknowledged, it is often taken for granted and its permanence assumed. So therefore, under these circumstances, the statist agenda can be very alluring. It's often said the conservative despises government. The conservative does not despise government. He despises tyranny. This is precisely why the conservative reveres the Constitution and insists on adherence to it. The conservative is alarmed by the ascent of a soft tyranny and its cheery acceptance by what I call the neo-statists. These would be the phony pseudo-conservatives. He knows that liberty once lost is rarely recovered. He knows of the decline and eventual failure of past republics. And he knows that the best prescription for addressing society's real and perceived ailments is not to further empower an already enormous federal government beyond its constitutional limits, but to return to the founding principles. A free people living in a civil society, working in self-interested cooperation, and a government operating within the limits of its authority promote more prosperity, opportunity, and happiness for more people than any alternative. Conservatism is the antidote to tyranny precisely because its principles are the founding principles. The conservative. Does the conservative support change? And if the conservative supports change, we hear this phrase all the time, then what change does the conservative support? Well, Edmund Burke explained it. He said there's a manifest, marked distinction which ill men with ill designs or weak men incapable of any design will constantly be confounding. And that is a marked distinction between change and reformation. Change alters the substance of the objects themselves and gets rid of all their essential good, as well as of all the accidental evil annexed to them. Change is novelty, and whether it is to operate any one of the effects of reformation at all, or whether it may not contradict the very principle upon which reformation is desired, cannot be known beforehand. In other words, change is utterly and completely irresponsible. Reformation, on the other hand, is not change in the substance or the primary modification of the object, but a direct application of a remedy to the grievance complained of. So in other words, in today's context, Burke would strongly oppose the destruction of the private healthcare system and the imposition of a government-run healthcare system because of all the damage foreseen and unforeseen that it will in fact do. He continues, so far as that is removed, all is sure. It stops there, and if it fails, that is reformation, the substance which underwent the operation, at the very worst, is but where it was. So what do we conservatives support? Reformation, not fundamental change. So for Burke, change as reform was intended to preserve and improve the basic institutions of the state. Change as innovation was destructive as a radical departure from the past. And the substitution of existing institutions of the state were potentially dangerous experiments. Furthermore, the statist often justifies change as conferring new, abstract rights, which is nothing more than a statist deception, intended to empower the state and deny man his real rights, those that are both unalienable and anchored in custom, tradition, and faith. Burke wrote, by this unprincipled facility of changing the state as often and as much and in as many ways as there are floating fancies and fashions, the whole chain and continuity of the Commonwealth would be broken. He was rejecting what today would be Marxism-socialism. He said no one generation can link with the other. Men would become little better than the flies of summer. The conservative understands that Americans are living in a state of diminishing liberty, that statism is on the ascendancy, and the societal balance is tipping away from ordered liberty. And in these circumstances, the conservative should not confuse prudence with timidity. If anything, certainly since the New Deal, the conservative has too often lacked the confidence and persistence to defend the civil society.